Okay, folks, I'm going to give a very rapid introduction to the implications of abundance for historical inquiry. In some ways, this is a prelude to our a lecture on distant reading, which uh, really ought to be done separately. And anyway, would make this lecture way too long to have any possibility of anybody watching it before class because I'm so late getting it up online. Uh, Okay, so just to remember what we talked about before in this kind of content-oriented part of the class, uh, remember that the, we are in some kind of an interesting moment in the evolution of the public sphere that has a lot to do with our technological infrastructure and what's happened to information and media technology. Um, remember, uh, I read something that made me angry. Let's not talk about that. Uh, yeah, and that's actually out of date. Okay, so uh, for most of the lifetime of our profession, the historical profession, uh, there was relatively little recorded compared to what was done in a society, and um, we can think about this by interrogating the category prehistoric, right? So we talk about prehistoric times. What does that mean? It you know the the main thing that it means is that the members of that society did not have a good recording mechanism that could be passed on to uh, generations and generations later to people who lived many thousands of years later, right? So the members of prehistoric societies did not think they lived in prehistoric times. They merely lacked a good preservation mechanism or medium. So lots was happening. There was lots of continuity and also disruption in prehistoric times, but we will never know about those things because uh, while oral uh, uh, storytelling or oral um, preservation of information is actually excellent for many purposes and is has been demonstrated to be remarkably um, effective, even across long spans of time. It is really terrible at preserving information across the the boundary of a cultural tradition. So, if a cultural tradition is dramatically changed, or in some cases even extinguished, then oral tra- oral tradition leaves nothing behind. And since oral tradition was one of the principal ways of moving information from one generation to the next uh, for most of the lifetime of the human species, we have very little information from those earlier phases of human life. Uh, and even as we move into the era of recorded history, it still is the case that very tiny percentage of what happened was recorded, and uh, and even of that which was recorded, uh, very small fractions were preserved in, to the extent that they survive in our time. And so the task of the historian was often, for most of our profession, to locate rare sources that had not often been found, usually in a faraway place. So the historian would be, you know, a Westerner from a metropolitan area, from London or Paris or Berlin or New York, and the historian would travel to some faraway place and uncover new documents. Um, so that had lots of implications for the discipline. For one, the history that we could tell was always skewed to tell the stories of those whose records appeared to be worth saving to their contemporaries. And so uh, we, in, in some ways, could only study the people who had control of the preservation mechanism. Um, and also, the record was always fragmentary. And so historians were at liberty to fill in the gaps in the records that they found. And that became part of our method, was developing stories about the gaps. Um, and then Also, one of the kind of cool things about this state of affairs was that in a given specialization, it was often possible to read a large percentage of the relevant sources for your project. And so there was a sense in which, as a historian, you could at least imagine that you had some mastery of your source material. We now live in a very different era in which large fractions of uh, of preserved written material has been already uh, kind of transmuted into digital form. Uh, and then, so first of all, we have enormous archives available to us without traveling. Uh, but also, we are recording way more, a much, much higher percentage of our activity than we were before because so much of our lives occurs online in um, in formats and in venues where that information is preserved, at least for now. And we'll talk for a moment about the problems of preservation. Um, yeah. Uh, so remember that this is when we live on the web, we live in an environment of mechanical discourse. So all of our discourse is turned into this uh, this format that can be understood by computers. Um, and preservation is an automatic feature of the systems in which we live. But we might want to think about, and this is very important for us as historians, by whom is that information preserved and for whom, for what purposes. So Google, Facebook, Twitter are preserving huge amounts of data. So are Tesla and Samsung. Tesla, everything that happens in every Tesla car, every event is transmitted by satellite back to Tesla's data banks and fed into their enormous artificial intelligence um, uh, data centers. Uh, so Tesla's producing petabytes, thousands of terabytes, millions of gigabytes of data on a regular basis. Uh, so that's really interesting. But right now, uh, the access to that information is limited. And how does a historian compete with what Google and Facebook, Twitter, Apple, Tesla, and Samsung are doing? And we can think in our current historical moment about the tracking data that is being used for COVID-related apps for uh, test, track, isolate procedures. And we can think about like all the ethical problems there, and then also about what a historian might do with that kind of information and how it might lead to different kinds of historical inquiry. Um, so this leads to a kind of interesting set of circumstances for us as historians, where we might, really need to wonder: can we still do what we used to do? Right? It's no longer possible to read everything. So um, even in the old days, in like when I was reading documents in German and French archives in the 1990s for my dissertation, there was already this sense of, oh my God, can I really read everything? And now it's really impossible. We know for certain that we cannot read everything relevant to a topic that interests us. So that raises the question: who is gonna do the reading for us? What will it mean to be an expert? Can we automate our reading somehow? And that's going to be the question that we talk about in distant reading. Um, the narrative forms that we've developed as historians to convey our findings to a public and make them interesting are in some ways ill-suited to these massive quantities of data that are now available. So can we and do we need to develop new types of narrative to deal with this information glut as opposed to information scarcity? Uh, on the flip side, those are some challenges. Um, but also we may be able to do different kinds of things as historians. We may be able to actually answer in a compelling way big questions of the kind that we abandoned in the 19th and 20th centuries, because, well, especially the 20th century, because we started to realize the limitations of uh, of our, of our knowledge. Um, what used to be pure speculation, maybe we can now make concrete and compelling in new ways. So, we may be able to answer questions like, how does the role of religion in public discourse change over time? How do railroads impact social and economic development, and so forth? Maybe you can think of, sort of pause and think, what are some big questions that we might be able to answer once we have available to us massive quantities of information that are tractable, that are computationally tractable? Um, yeah, and so those are super important questions. There, I also have here on the same slide some questions about what other challenges digitization brings with it, in particular, problems of scale, uh, precision, uh, and uh, and preservation, because we are dependent right now on an infrastructure uh, of hard drives and cloud computing that is very recent. Like, we know how to preserve paper. We've done a very good job of it for a long time. We're not so good at preserving hard drives, and in fact, in the 1970s and 80s, there were lots and lots of problems with preservation media, which are not as severe now, but um, will likely reappear later in the later in the century. Um, and then there's this thing called bit rot, which is that computer programming languages change and computer code stops working. And so, you know, uh, web pages written in the early 2000s often break because they refer to libraries that are no, programming libraries, that is pieces of code, which are no longer available online. They have lots of broken links and so forth. And that preservation project is a difficult one that other people are looking into. We can talk about that another time. So, to summarize to some extent, the problem of abundance offers many challenges: challenges of preservation, challenges of interpretation, challenges of access, which we didn't need to talk about as much. Um, and, and we have to think about how those challenges might, press us to uh, transform the historical enterprise. What is our relationship to sources? What are the kinds of arguments that we can make? And what are the narrative forms that we need to deal with abundance? And then, just to transition a little bit towards the question of distant reading, um, when we think about problems, uh, if we think about literary history, uh, we work in literary history with it at a minuscule fraction of literary texts that were produced in the past. Um, and as Ramsey says in an essay that you have in your syllabus, it's one thing to worry that your canon isn't sufficiently inclusive or broad or representative. It's another thing when your canon has no better chance of being these things than a random selection does. When we get up into the 14 million book range, which is we've passed, books that are known by more than two living people are already popular. So think about that. So uh, the vast majority of works produced in the 18th and 19th centuries have not been read by any living person. And so, if we want to make statements about the literature of the 18th and 19th centuries, we're going to do so based on this very small fraction of works that has survived through processes which we don't really fully understand, right? And which are not like, there's not like a conscious decision to create a canon. Instead, the canon emerges through sets of decisions that maybe we would not agree to in the present day. So, yeah, it's not just that the emperor has no clothes, it's that that no one knows what the emperor looks like at all. Like we have, it's not just that you could be wrong about uh, the shape of 19th century literature, it's that nobody could evaluate your claims about the shape of 19th century literature. And that's true for a lot of topics that matter to us in the historical profession. And so when we come to talk about the project of distant reading in a future lecture, we will do so with the background of these kind of fundamental questions that awareness of abundant information brings. All right, I hope you enjoyed that, and see you in class.